Yeah. Hello and welcome to this third edition of Acumen, the webinar platform from PM Power, where we bring you experiential insights from the trenches. Every month, we'll have experts share their insights on topics to inspire you to accelerate your journey of delivery excellence. At PM Power, we help organizations achieve agility in design and delivery of software services. Today's topic is anti-patterns in an Agile and Scrum environment. I'm sure in your journeys, you all would have had a lot of lists of do's and don'ts, doing all the right things, and then not doing things that you're not supposed to do. But sometimes they always don't work well. So in today's conversation, Veeraraaghavan, or JV, who is the principal consultant and Agile expert at PM Power Consulting, with over 36 years of experience in IT and software services and 10 years of experience as an Agile coach. He has helped many organizations transform to Agile practices. He has also held senior management roles in Tata Burroughs and Novell. Welcome, JV.
Thank you.
And in conversation with JV is Ashish Kasi, who is the India site lead and VP of technology at 24/7.ai. He has been in the industry for over 23 years, and he also heads the product operations function and the Agile transformation across the company. Prior to this, he was the CTO of Capillary Technologies and also headed the engineering for the small business group at Yahoo. So before we get on with the session, some housekeeping. You all participants will join the session in a muted mode. You can always converse with the speakers through chat. You can use Alt-H or choose the chat button on your screen, and then you can type the questions. We will take the questions towards the end of the session. We should have at least about 15 minutes for Q&A. And through the session, you can keep typing messages. So with this, let me hand this over to JV and Ashish.
Thanks, Shiv. Good afternoon, Ashish. Nice to have you. Wonderful to have a chat with you on and get your rich perspectives on some of the anti-patterns that we actually see with respect to Agile adoption and management and leadership. It's a pleasure to have you as a co-presenter and from a discussion perspective. So let's begin by.
Thank you very much, JV. It's good to be here and look forward to a good conversation.
Thanks, Ashish. So we'll set the context, what we're trying to cover through this session. One clear thing that we wanted to make sure as a disclaimer is there's not necessarily a do's and don'ts, good, bad practices kind of session in Agile Scrum. One of the reasons for that is it's too broad a topic for such a session. Ultimately, we will talk about some good and good practices and so on and so forth, but this is not in any sense an exhaustive list of good and bad practices or a list of do's and don'ts. What we're trying to cover is a set of what we call as anti-patterns. We'll actually look at what anti-patterns are in the next slide. Basically, some of these have been observed, experienced in our implementation and coaching. Ashish has actually got quite a lot of experience in transformation efforts in many companies. And from my own perspective, I've had experience with coaching several teams, close to 100 teams over the last 10 years. So whatever has been most commonly observed as an anti-pattern in the kind of organizations that we have worked with, that's really what we're trying to share. And one of the key things is, from a participant perspective, what you need to understand when we talk about anti-patterns is they're not necessarily always bad when you start your journey. Some of the anti-patterns that we talk about may actually be okay in your context to start with, but as you get mature, you will realize that those are not necessarily good practices to continue. So that's really something that we will look at. We'll also look at implications of some of these anti-patterns and see what alternate approaches that we can adopt. Now, one of the important things that I want to mention before we get into the talking a little bit more about specific anti-patterns is that this is again a very broad topic. So what we're trying to do through this first session is like a breadth first kind of approach. As we were discussing specific things for discussion during the session, we actually realized that this topic is a very vast topic, and we can actually take specific areas. For example, anti-patterns in a metrics environment, Ashish. That's something that's a topic for itself, and I'm sure we can have a complete session on what are the kind of things that organizations actually not necessarily do well when they actually implement metrics to as part of governance in their projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we do believe that some of these topics deserve a separate session in itself. And what we are looking at is a series over the course of the next 1 year, where we are looking at multiple topics on the Agile anti-pattern side, where we go to specific areas. For example, the role of the Scrum Master, product owner, and things like that. That we could look at anti-patterns in that area. So we are looking at some of those so that we will have follow-up sessions on this. So that's something that should interest most of you as participants. So when you look at anti-patterns, I just want to set the context. I borrowed a definition from Jim Copeland, who's a researcher in Brussels, a computer scientist researcher in Brussels. And it's an interesting definition. It says anti-pattern is something that looks like a good idea. That's a key thing. On the face of it, when you look at some practices which we call as anti-patterns, they may not necessarily be bad ideas. They may not sound like bad ideas. But the key thing is, in moderation, some of those will work fine. But when we actually try to implement it and observe it over a period of time, you would find that they're not necessarily good ideas. They kind of backfire. So as we look at specific anti-patterns, you have got to look at your own, as an organization, where you are in the maturity curve. For example, if you look at the Shuhari kind of maturity cycle, if you are in the shoe stage, some of the anti-patterns may look okay for you to start with, right? Because you're trying to actually move away from, let's say, a conventional way of working into an agile way of working. So you can start with some of those practices, but as you observe the results, you won't find that it's in accordance with what you expect from an agile setup. That's really where you need to figure out what's really going wrong and go and correct it, right? So before I kind of get Ashish's inputs, I thought I'll share some perspectives on some of the anti-patterns that we have observed from a coaching perspective in planning. The first thing that comes to my mind is when you look at planning from a capacity utilization perspective. I think a lot of organizations, when they do their sprint planning, look at capacity of individuals in their utilization and say, hey, I want to make sure that every individual is utilized 100%, the whole team is utilized 100%, and so on. And even us as coaches, when teams have undertaken an agile journey, in the earlier stages, we actually help them. Even though we look at some velocity as a whole, from a holistic perspective in terms of planning across sprints, but when you get into a sprint, we actually say, look at what capacity is available within your team from a dev perspective or a QA perspective, split it into tasks, estimate effort, and so on and so forth. By itself is not a bad practice when you start. But what ends up happening is sometimes when you use it repeatedly over a period of time, there is a tendency for people to somehow ensure that they are fully utilized. So when you look at task estimation, there is an effect on what's the estimate for a task, right? The other thing is managers also start looking at some of this data. They start getting worried that somebody is not fully utilized. People are not putting 40 hours per week. So some of the behavior that actually gets influenced when you look at capacity and utilization driven planning is not necessarily right from a team perspective or for an individual perspective or even from a manager's perspective. So what we actually recommend as you move forward is that you actually look at outcome, right? What's the team expected to accomplish over a period of time? What have they accomplished over the last 3 sprints or 4 sprints or 3 releases? How can I use that data to figure out what the team can accomplish moving forward? And then the team actually looks at what they need to do and then figures out this is the kind of output that I can actually do. In fact, many of the organizations that I have worked with, to start with, they have actually done some of the capacity utilization driven planning. But as they get mature and the team starts doing well, then they actually get into velocity or throughput driven planning. And my own experience, I've seen teams productivity go up from almost like 60 to 70% over the course of 1.5 to 2 years when they actually use throughput driven planning, because then the team can actually push itself up. But when you get into capacity driven planning, the kind of behaviors that it supports is not necessarily what we would like to see in a good agile team. Second thing that I've seen in some organizations is when they're trying to get accurate estimates for an epic, they try to use the spike story as a concept. By itself, spike story is not a bad concept to use, but when you're trying to do this for every epic that you get, because you don't want to go and commit to your product owner that I'm going to deliver this many epics in a sprint, or and so on and so forth. There is a tendency to say I can get accurate estimates only when I actually go and design the epic, right? Get a lot of detail in terms of how it's going to get implemented, do some kind of a preliminary design, get into task level, and then say this is what it's going to take. And the spike story is intended to actually do some kind of even a preliminary design, right? Not only break the epic up, but even do some kind of a preliminary design so they can actually get accurate estimates. I think you don't necessarily get very accurate estimates, because in the situation, one or two situations I've seen, the product owners have actually come back and told me that the team did a spike. They came back and said it will take them 1 sprint or 2 sprints to do this. And then in real life, they were not able to complete it in 1 or 2 sprints, even though they did an elaborate spike on that. And the reason when you go back to the team is that, we made this assumption when we did the spike, but when we actually went and implemented it, lots of things changed. And which is the reality in today's world. As most of you are aware of how typically requirements evolve, designs evolve as you do it. So it's always good to get into detail when you're doing it, rather than too much of detail, too far ahead in planning. I think that's really the key thing. So the spike stories I always recommend is used to prove a concept. I'm trying to prove a concept, or I need some information to do a high-level estimate. So when I say high-level estimate, I'm able to do some relative estimation, right? T-shirt sizing or story point estimation. I want to compare one epic and another. I want to compare one story and another and say this is where the story belongs. So do I have adequate enough information to do that? That's really the primary intent of a spike. We shouldn't be going beyond that and doing design, right? The third, the other one, recommended as part of doing a spike is to make sure that you time box the spike so that you don't spend too much effort in doing it. The third anti-pattern that I've seen in planning is in some sense a follow-up to the previous one that I talked about in terms of spikes. Big teams tend to get into a very detail-driven planning, right? They want to get every detail before they actually go and start working on a sprint, right? So tasks are estimated in great detail, estimates are arrived at, and so on and so forth, independent of the level of planning. Even when I do release planning, I tend to get into a lot of detail and say, I need so many hours to do this, and so on and so forth. So basically it's important for teams to understand that when you're doing a very detailed level planning, it's not necessarily true that a detailed documentation gets you an accurate estimate. For example, I've seen situations where there are 5-page documents for a story, right? The biggest issue that teams get into when they do a very detailed documentation is it breaks the conversations between them and the PO, right? The whole idea is the team needs to have a conversation with PO and come back and be able to understand what the story or an epic is supposed to do. But when they expect a detailed documentation from the PO sits and writes in a corner, and the team actually goes and implements, and they make their own assumptions, right? And in the process, the conversation between the team and the PO, which is the fundamental principle of Agile or value behind Agile, gets compromised, right? So what is important when you do planning at a sprint level also is to ensure that you have basic level of detail for a story, what the story is expected to do, what the acceptance criteria are, and so on. And then have the team debate with the product owner what is expected out of the story, right? What kind of issues exist in a customer environment, what's the usage scenario for that story, and so on and so forth. So that the detail emerges as the team discusses with the product owner, rather than actually expect a lot of detailed documentation to do it. And you actually do primarily high-level estimates so that you can forecast schedules, right? Story point estimating and so on and so forth, till you actually need to get into a detailed level of planning, right? And as you refine, as you learn.
Yeah, I just had one point to add. There is what you said is absolutely right, but in many companies you have to do planning at various stages. There is the sprint level planning, and sometimes you have to give a quarterly look ahead in terms of roadmaps, so that the sales can sell what you're going to build. I think one of the anti-patterns I have seen, and we are currently looking at a planning cycle in 24/7, and we are trying to address this, is using very high precision techniques when you have lower uncertainty. right? And let's say you're looking at a quarter look ahead.
Some kind of a release plan at a quarter.
And some kind of a release planning, right? And you have an idea of the concepts.
Okay.
And very often I see managers trying to do very high precision mandate estimations when the certainty is not yet is very low about it. So I think it's important if you take the cone of uncertainty and all products go through it. It's important that you use the right precisions based on the certainty levels. So I would choose a little lower precision, maybe short sizing when you have to do forecasting,
right?
A little further away, and maybe we can do more relatively high precision with velocities as you get closer to the 2-week cycle. So I think that's a useful model which we are trying to adapt.
I agree. I think one of my own experiences with the company that I work with, they use this concept of story points at a sprint and release level. And then when they're trying to compare release to release, they actually use the concept of epic points.
That's right.
So what they actually did is they did an epic and then broke it down into stories.
Absolutely.
They actually said, oh, this epic is worth 50 story points, right? And then they looked at other epics. Some other epics was 80 story points. Some other epic was 30 story points, etc. And then they actually said, this epic is bigger than this epic is smaller than this, and then their own relative sizing there. And so the smallest epic was given, let's say, a 1-point epic point or 3 epic points. And then when new epics started coming in, which were not broken down into stories, they actually said, oh, this epic is expected to do this. So this epic vis-a-vis this epic that you've actually done already. So if I have done an epic and that was worth 3 points or 5 epic points, I can actually compare this new epic that I'm going to do. For example, I'm doing a add order, a change order. Then cancel order. How does cancel order work with respect to, let's say, change order? That kind of a stuff. So then you can compare and make sure that, how well does it work? Absolutely. Epic points and things like that. So moving into execution. So one of the anti-patterns that I have observed, and I'm sure this is true with many organizations, when team members get into working in a sprint, right, the first thing that they do is they take a lot of stories. If they're working on 10 stories, they say, oh, there are 5 developers. Each developer will take responsibility for 2 stories, right? And then they will work in parallel. And by itself is not a bad idea, because when you begin, you want to make sure that the work is distributed, and whoever is the most expertise in a particular area, they will actually pick up that story, and then they will actually continue to work. Now, the drawback with this practice is that very often all stories get completed in the last 1 or 2 days of the sprint. And if your QA team is actually working on drawing up test cases and scenarios and automation, etc., typically they get all the stories delivered in the last 2 days or 3 days. And if they end up finding a lot of bugs, you actually get into a situation where bug fixing is incomplete when you complete the sprint. So invariably, a lot of stories actually get pushed to the next sprint. And I've seen stories getting pushed from sprint to sprint, and the completion rate, plan versus actual, if you really look at some of these teams, is extremely low. And the team is working really hard to do that, right? The way that we actually recommend that you overcome this pattern is to ensure that you have shared ownership for stories. We promote this concept of what we call a swarming, where the team members come together on a story as much as possible. For example, you can take 1 story or 2 stories at the beginning, and the entire team works on those 1 or 2 stories, right? And then completes the story. And then they get into the next story. So the advantage with this is you are actually completing a certain number every few days, number of stories every few days. And so the chances of stories slipping into the next sprint is extremely low. I've actually seen one team that I work with very beautifully on this. The way they actually did it is they planned based on a velocity that they accomplished. And what they would do is on the first day of planning, they would actually say, we are going to take up these stories based on what we have done in the past. This is what the gut feel for us is. And actually plan at a high level in terms of tasks for this. And then put it on the board. The first day of execution, they actually come there, and then and as part of the daily stand-up, somebody says, I'm going to pick up this task, I'm going to pick up that task, etc., etc. Each one picks up a task for a story from the first story on the board. And then they aim to complete that as quickly as possible. Yeah. And then the second day, they actually come and say, this is the task that I'm going to pick up. So on an actually day-to-day basis, they do their planning in terms of what they're going to do. with the primary focus of the team on the goal of finishing it within the sprint or within the first few days, so that by the end of the sprint they can finish all stories. And their track record of actual to plan was very good, excellent. And so this is something that I've seen actually works, shared ownership and responsibility, and that also builds in self-organization within the team. The other one that I've seen is, we always talk about this potentially shippable increments, which is what was intended for Agile when we talked about Scrum and so on and so forth as a concept. But many teams actually forget that potentially shippable increments does not necessarily mean they are, you are releasing the product. You still need to spend effort for release. And one of the teams that I worked with, they spent a phenomenal amount recently. Even though they had a potentially shippable increment, when the release happened 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, they were actually putting in a lot of effort for releasing the stories they actually developed, right? So what you need to make sure is that if you have good engineering practices that have continuous integration, testing, deployment, and so on and so forth, as and when you do it, you can try and deploy it in a production-like environment as quickly as possible, even if you are not releasing it. Deploy it, make sure that it works in that deployment. And so if you need to roll it out, you can actually roll it out anytime, that kind of stuff. The last one, most people tend to postpone automation to a future sprint so that they can actually deliver more business value. There is pressure from the product owner to deliver more stories. So there is a tendency to say, if I want to do more stories, let me drop the automation. And this has obviously a this has a negative effect because over a period of time, the automation builds so much. In one of the organizations that I worked with, the automation built, the backlog built so much that they were finding it unmanageable. Right? Every release that they had to make, they spent a phenomenal amount of effort regression testing. So what they actually did was, fortunately, the engineering head and the product management head sat together and say, for one release, we are actually going to do primarily focus on automation. So 80% of the release effort was dedicated to test automation and only 20% for new features. And then they got back and they were on a roll after that. So this worked beautifully, but we don't want organizations to get into this kind of a mode, especially if you're building a new product. As you automate, as you go is probably the best way to do that, right? Your DoD needs to include automation as you build the product.
Have you had experiences with TDD and the XP in teams and seen successes?
TDD, definitely yes. Pair programming, specifically, the culture that we work with, somehow I have not seen it work as well. Even though in some situations where you're trying to build a junior programmer, the capability of a junior programmer, it's always good to pair the person with the senior, and then the learning is good. But TDD, definitely yes. Even if teams have not done 100% automation, the concept of thinking about testing in the beginning and making sure that the developers, the QA, and the product owner sit together and figure out how is this product going to be tested. All of them are on the same page on that, and then the automation starts in parallel. And even if it's not completely test-driven development, if testing is decided a priori and testing and development actually go hand in hand, and they actually constantly make sure that they are doing that, that's actually works reasonably well. Ideally, if you are able to do TDD fully, great. But at least thinking about it as a first step and then getting into development based on that. The other concept that I find very hard to resist in most teams is the concept of hardening sprints. Most teams actually spend a substantial amount of effort towards the end of the release cycle doing hardening. So basically, we just need to make sure that we understand that hardening brings with it its own overheads, right? And what I've seen, Ashish, in some cases, the teams do 40 story points for 3 months, right? And then they find there is a huge backlog of defects. And they've got to do the hardening. And the hardening actually carries on for 2 months. The teams do nothing else but hardening for 2 months. In those 2 months, the team is actually delivering 0 points per iteration. So if you really look at it, the gross velocity in the first 3 months was something really great, 40. And then suddenly you find the whole thing was delivered over 5 months, not 3 months. Because during hardening, they were not really delivering any value, right? Except improve the quality of the product. So the idea of hardening actually postpones quality to the end. Whereas what you need to think about is how do you actually build quality right from the beginning? So, can you do automated testing? Can you do test-driven development? Can you do continuous integration? So that you're building quality into the product, and the need for hardening reduces dramatically. I'm not saying that for a large product, you don't need a hardening cycle at all. You may need some effort in integration and so on and so forth to the end, but you can reduce that effort substantially. And the last thing, people talk about best practices, standardized practices, etc., etc. The moment you say best practice, it actually means that you have nothing else to improve. I always like to call them good practices, but look at your own context, right? Some practice may be very good in your context, but may not necessarily be applicable in some other context. So you need to figure out what actually works. For example, even pair programming. Some organizations where the culture is really, really good, pair programming works beautifully. I do know 1 or 2 companies where it works very well. But in some of the organizations where the culture doesn't support it, you don't want to push that right in the beginning. So it's a concept or a practice that actually works for some company in some environment need not necessarily work the same level in some other organization. So that's basically on the execution side. Any from your side?
I think one anti-pattern which comes to mind, which I've seen in my teams is, and we have discussed about, I think the intent is typically good for this anti-pattern, but it doesn't really get you the return or the value that you finally want. Is to really see, think of scrums and say, I will just increase the size of the duration of my sprint. I'll make a 2-week sprint into a 3 or a 4-week sprint or a 5-week sprint, and therefore I will get better velocity and productivity, right?
Okay.
I think the intent is pretty good in the sense that they feel that if I have more time, I can actually finish more work and I can complete what is deliverable unit. But the better approach to solving this problem is to make sure that your epics and stories are split into the right sizes, that you have sizes which are more consumable, that they actually are completable in a sprint. And therefore, you are holding accountable teams in shorter periods. As I said, the uncertainty increases when the time increases. And you always want to look at trying to keep it to the smallest duration you can get to.
Absolutely.
And achieve it.
And I think I've also seen this. Some companies which actually start with 3-week and 4-week cycles. When you say 2 weeks, they resist it. But when they actually get success with 2 weeks, they don't want to go away from 2 weeks. So anyway, last aspect that I want to quickly touch upon before, Ashish, I want you to talk about leadership and management is in the product management side. So I've seen most product managers have a greed for features. I need all features in the product. I think one of the ways to deal with it is need an effective PO who understands that prioritizing the backlog and determining what the MVP is actually very crucial. And they need to understand Agile. In fact, I've seen many POs don't understand the real intent of Agile. They believe that Agile means any changes can be taken anytime. So teams need to deliver everything and I can change anytime. Whereas they need to understand that there is a certain mechanism that actually needs to be in place to ensure that Agile is successful, right? Like prioritization and MVP and so on and so forth. The other thing is a lot of times, product managers push for milestones, saying that this is what I want, this is what I want. The teams don't have the, they don't know why they are doing what they are doing. Whereas if they actually know why they are doing what they are doing, they will be able to do much better. So even developers make their own decisions when they implement. So if I know why am I doing this, maybe I'll take the right decision when I implement it. Whereas if you just tell me what to do, I don't even think about it. So I think the business value and why something is being done is also important from a PO perspective. And sometimes I find POs getting involved in sizing and estimation, getting into the way the team works and managing the backlog. Yeah, they are an important stakeholder, right? I'm not denying that. But I believe that that's not a good practice. They need to make sure that estimates are done by the team. The sprint backlog is actually owned by the team. That's really the responsibility of them. And of course, the last thing, and I'm sure you have seen this also, a lot of mid-sprint changes, commitment changes, priority changes. I understand that the team needs to be adapting to change as things happen. But I think if the team is given certain things to deliver in a sprint, give them the ability to do that. If you have changes, they always have subsequent sprints to take care. So
I think just one point towards the last anti-pattern you have there is one of the things we saw the same thing, where we used to get a lot of changes right in the middle of the sprint. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have mixed impedances in a Scrum. Mm-hmm. You have things which are not controllable, which change very rapidly, mm-hmm. and there are those which you can plan for. Mm-hmm. It's important, I think, to separate those two as much as you can. I normally use a separate sprint or use a Kanban when you cannot really predict, and it's going to be changing very often.
That's true.
While I use more of these, Scrum models when I can plan for it.
Okay.
Right. So very often the changes could be reduced if you just separate the ingredients and get it going.
Absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah. So actually, what I wanted to talk about primarily was more from typically planning, execution, and product management. But I believe that there is a substantial area for management and leadership to come in and ensure that some of these anti-patterns don't show up, because I believe that they lay the foundation, right? You agree?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think ideally I would like you to look at and let me know, or let us know, in terms of what kind of anti-patterns you have seen when you work with managers and the leadership team.
Absolutely. I think this is an area which is talked about less in the Scrum world and in the Agile world. I can give you a bit of the anti-patterns I've seen both as a manager and working with my managers, as well as an executive and a sponsor to agility in the company, or when we are transforming. Let me talk about some of the patterns I've seen. Right. One of the anti-patterns which I often see is, this is going one by one. All right. Okay, great. One of the anti-patterns I see is a manager as a Scrum Master. Initially, when you're doing transformation, the roles are not fully clarified and not very, it's not yet fully accepted by all, right? And as managers, your sense of accountability sometimes comes in the way of what is the right agile mindset that you need to look at this with. I think the way I would look at this is that I feel that managers and Scrum Masters are very different roles. It's very rarely that I've seen a good manager who's also can play this role at the same time and do justice to both. And part of that reason is because of the expectations, the how you do things is very different. Scrum Master is very much like a servant leader to the team. He has a more of a service mindset when it comes to working with the team, while a manager comes from the chain of authority. Now, in any team, you need both. You need the manager, in any organization, not in a team. In an organization, you need both. You need a certain degree of chain of authority, and that is important in many aspects. They manage people. They have to work towards setting the right people, process, product, technologies, mentorship, all those aspects. Right. And that is very important. And you do need some chain of authority for that. And then there is the ability to enable and empower the team, which is the fundamentals of Agile, where I think the whole servant leadership concept comes into play. So I think that is one of the differences, and they often conflict in the way you do things.
Yeah. In fact, I also believe that many organizations that have tried to implement Scrum Master as a line manager, a development manager as a Scrum Master, have not succeeded because the team behavior changes.
Yes.
Unless you have an extraordinarily facilitative manager.
Yes.
Who can actually work with the team. I've seen this work in probably 1 out of 10 instances.
Yes.
9 out of 10 where the manager is playing a Scrum Master role generally doesn't work. So one of the reasons why Scrum does not advise a Scrum Master being a manager is that the team, the behavior changes dramatically if the manager plays a role. Number one. Number two, even the Scrum Master's role needs to be a lot more facilitative. They cannot get into the team as a project manager kind of work.
Absolutely.
Right? They need to understand that their role is to influence, facilitate, make sure that they work with the stakeholders, all of that, which means that that's a completely different skill set. I think one needs to look at that as well.
I think what we have decided to do is either have dedicated SMs, Scrum Masters, and I find that it's easier to move from just a good, reasonable Scrum Master to a great Scrum Master where he's influencing the product, the team, the practices, and everything when you have a more dedicated person.
Absolutely.
Or the other alternative is if there is the right person with the right behaviors and the right abilities to look from within the team and to have him play that role. So we have gone with one or the other. Some teams are doing dedicated, some are not. But that's the preferred model we have.
Okay.
Yeah, so the other part I find interesting, and this is as managers, we are all responsible for budgeting. And we often consider this to be a corporate function, right? And that we really have to just comply, and there's nothing much I can do with it. To some degree, this is right. I would call this a half anti-pattern, in the sense that in companies, you don't have full control over changing everything. But what I believe you can do as a manager, and manager is also an influensive role, is that you can influence the way you do your budgeting. For example, if you have a certain limited, and this is by the way, budgeting is one of those evils which you have to have as an organization for fiscal responsibility, so that you can't really say, let's not do it. In many organizations, you don't have that luxury. So, but, and also budgeting is not always the most agile process around things. So, what I see as the best way to address this is to think of budgeting with the right outlook. That is, keep agile in mind. For example, if you have a limited set of people, spend more time looking at how to create complete collaborative teams within your groups, rather than think of individual resource needs. Look at how you would assign initiatives to teams rather than individuals,
resources and individuals.
so that you can look at costing it as a team would. And you can also achieve all those good things you talked about in executive of swarming, etc. Just by the nature of having a team. Absolutely. So thinking of budgeting and looking at resourcing from a complete team perspective, and not compromising on it when you come to creating budgets is, I think, an important element. And as managers, we influence that, even though we often don't change. And in my company, I've also had our CFO come and say, how can I make this better, more broader? So I know that they also appreciate it.
They also want to make sure that they get into the agile mode.
I think the third part is, the third anti-pattern I see is that many management, when they're hearing it for the first time, they say, we always talk about self-organized teams. And they think of that as something that immediately occurs after the person has started this agile transformation.
That's like a they get a magic potion.
Yes.
The team is self-organized. I don't need to do it.
Yes. So self-organizing to me is a journey. And very often that journey has to be invested in. And the manager has a huge role to play in this investment. The manager is responsible for mentorship. He's responsible for leading the people, the process. He's responsible for partnering with teams and with Scrum Masters. And all of this is investments in the journey towards self-organizing. And you as a manager have to have that mindset that you want them to get there, and that this is not going to be an instant karma where things happen spontaneously.
That brings us a very interesting point, that manager's role actually is much, much broader the way you are describing.
Absolutely.
In the olden world, the manager's role was thought about as a delivery role.
Absolutely.
Right? Whereas what you're talking about in terms of enabling the team, making the team ready for it, making sure that the different stakeholders of the team is able to interact with right, and planning for the roadmap, contributing. I mean, a lot of those aspects, contributing technically, functionally, people-wise, is a much richer role than going and delivering a specific release. Right?
I think the manager's responsibilities remains very similar. He's expected to do, but how he does it is what changes.
He was not able to do it before. Now that he's got time to do it.
Yes.
So actually, the ability to do that in an agile environment becomes better.
I've often seen that when I do this, managers can have larger seats. In my team, I have collapsed my team, made it more flat, with managers owning more things, and therefore feeling more relevant. Yeah, I think the last few patterns I would call out is, these are these anti-patterns of the organizations, right? When we think of SM as you mentioned, program management or coordination, or that QA is a siloed functions. And I think what we miss there is that we are not taking the roles and the responsibilities in the spirit of Agile. I think it's important that that always be the underlying theme in an organization to make it successful.
So is QA in your setup, for example, part of the Scrum team itself, meaning that they are not reporting to a separate QA manager?
It is good you asked. We used to have a more functional structure in the past. And we have moved into a structure where QA is owned by the team and by engineering. So it's all one integrated team.
That's, I think, good.
Yeah, and I think with this model, we expect to have more unit testing, the ability to invert the pyramid. right? Rather than just thinking of it as functional tests, we can start seeing a lot more tests of component level unit tests, APIs, happening in line with the sprints, adoption of practices where testing is done continuously. And more importantly, that the managers now have mindset towards quality, which is priceless when you get there, right? So, finally, one anti-pattern and very often talked about is tech debt is bad always. And I just wanted to call this out because tech debt is a continuous investment, but there is also what is good tech debt and bad tech debt, right? The way I see good tech debt is just like any loan you take as an individual, right? You take it and you want to make sure you plan for it, that you can you can pay it off, and that you have a clear path towards getting it off your books, right, in its form. So I see tech debt and technology very similar. I think you should always look at, let's say, for example, there is a need to get a customer on board on a new vertical which you have not got any experience towards. You might want to start with a certain hypothesis and assumption based on what the customer's needs are. And then you might have to make a certain deviation from your architecture, which is well known to the team, but that you're well aware of, and then you have a plan to fix it back in the next sprint. I think that's great. That's good tech debt, right? So bringing the revenue as quick as possible for the company, but you're also making sure you fix all those deviations as fast as possible.
So it's a planned evolution.
Planned evolution. And I think evolutionary architecture, especially where Agile talks about evolutionary architecture, you sometimes need to make those deviations for immediate gains, but you need to be able to correct it immediately. I think bad tech debt comes in when it just lingers on, or you create these debts without realizing you are, and then having a problem with it further down the line. Right? So I think it's important that one addresses tech debt, and it's done continuously through the process. Great. I think the other role as is as an executive and as a sponsor, and this is something I played here in 24/7 as well as in previous companies. One point I would like to mention is, just to explain this role, is it might not be there in every company. Sometimes the manager himself is the sponsor if it's a small company, but most mid-sized, large-sized companies typically, or growing companies, typically have the sponsor as an important, and an executive who is responsible for things. I think his role is really to vision outcomes, to lead change, to inspire the organization or the business units. He often is the sponsor of the Agile transformations. And when I was a sponsor here, I was very worried about how do I build a common fiber, because we have teams in India as well as in US and in Sweden. How do I build a common fiber on which we can get this transformation going? How do we sustain it? And how do we scale it? So a lot of the anti-patterns I'd like to discuss is related to that. And one of the anti-patterns I've realized, not so much in 24/7, but in my previous companies when I've looked into this, is the idea of Agile in isolation. I think Agile experimentation is good. A team should always experiment. But when you want to start making it into a culture, which is really what it is, and you want to impact a broader company or a broader function or organization, it needs to be converted into a corporate priority. And there should be a clear sponsor who is at an executive level who can hold that vision for you, right? It's important.
So there's a leadership commitment there.
Absolutely. The leadership commitment is extremely important. And the second part is blueprints. When you want to try to create a common fiber across many teams, it's important that you have a single blueprint or the Bible that everyone can refer to and contribute to. As the transformation happens. So these are two of the first few things that we try to, get within 24/7 before we started our transformation. In fact, one of our co-founders was the sponsor, and then later on, our chief product officer took it on. Wonderful. And then we go on to the other pattern, which is the engineering process or a model change, and thinking of agility as a very narrow aspect, rather than thinking of it as an overall mindset change or a cultural change in a company. I think very often we just think of it as this is a process and then make a checklist out of these things and start doing Agile rather than being Agile in an organization. I think as an executive sponsor, you have to always be watchful of that and ensure that you are trying to balance it out whenever you see those things happening.
In fact, I've seen this agility mindset. Most people, get confused about what this agility mindset is. I think they need to understand that, the concepts like flow of delivery, feedback, collaboration, learning, all of these need to be built into the whole process. That's really what the key thing is.
Yeah, I think this is something you had touched upon a little earlier, but I wanted to connect it also as a sponsor. I think it's not connecting agility and an agile transformation to corporate outcomes, or doing things like comparing team metrics across teams which have very different characteristics of what they're building, are all anti-patterns one should watch for. And what I use as a mantra here, and I present it to many folks, is think of it as outcome backward, process forward. And what I mean by that is you have an outcome that you as a company are trying to achieve, and you want to always look at that as the end goal and look how do you get there. And you don't want to do outcome backwards, in its form, in that sense. You want to get towards those outcomes, right? So think from how to get to those outcomes. And same thing from a process perspective. Process is what was the past and how does it continuously improve. So think of it as a process forward element. So it's very important that your goals and the team metrics connect to the outcomes of the company, because then it becomes a language that is understood by all.
There's much better alignment if you are able to do.
Absolutely.
Metrics and outcomes are aligned.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the important things as a sponsor that you need to drive to build those alignments in its form.
I think we probably have.
Yeah, I just have one other point here, and that is really around sustenance. Sustenance is a very, very important thing, and what really ends up with making failed agile transformations in companies is the lack of it. And very often, sustenance is simplified into thinking, if I just certify and train and get all these CSM certifications for folks or CSPOs, I'm done. And very often that's not the case. And I think it's important, if you have an LNOD team, that you partner with them, that they are a part of this transformation. And I think the other element I call out often is training is for awareness, but coaching is to sustain. So making sure that you have in-team coaching so that the behaviors are inculcated and ingrained into every individual on a more sustainable basis is important. And I think the other part is typically you have churn in companies. There's always 10 to 15% at least moving around. And it's important that your system can self-sustain itself when you have to continuously get in new people and continuously keep the training going.
So is that the reason you build something like a community of practice?
Absolutely. And community practice is more of a self-driven approach towards getting this done. You get all the Scrum Masters together, the product owners together, and then you use this as a forum where they can share. We have a pretty broad, more than 30 teams across multiple geos working together on a connected platform. So the more we can build a common fiber across teams, the more successful we get.
Actually, this is one thing that we also recommend. It's the cheapest way to actually be enterprise agile in a shorter time. Most people think that it's a very elaborate thing, but actually you're building sustenance internally. The goal is to sustain internally, which means that you're not only coaching, but building internal coaches on a community so that they can take it forward when the coaches leave.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is all about the sustenance.
Great. Thanks, Ashish. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions at least.
Yeah, it's been wonderful, Ashish and JB. We have a lot of questions. Let's see how many we can get through in the next few minutes. The first one from Narendra. I guess it is all about understanding, how do you measure the success of a sprint? I guess also of a project. From a pattern, I know you mentioned that you'll have a separate session on metrics. But then from a pattern or an anti-pattern, what is it that one should watch out for? Not to know that we are going on the right direction, if I may interpret what Narendra says.
Maybe I'll attempt and then maybe you can add to that. One thing I always believe is that sprint has a a goal defined for it. Typically, every team that takes a sprint on, there's a sprint defined goal, whether in terms of delivering a certain set of features or stories or ethics or whatever. Did the team deliver as committed as planned? Right? That's an important way to measure whether they did that. And obviously, the feedback from the partner or the customer to whom the product was demoed, I think that's an important element. So if you are able to deliver as planned and the customer is happy, I believe your sprint was successful. But that's a very simple way of looking at it. Yeah. Did you have anything else?
Yeah, I think we did look at a few things. There was a presentation we made recently on agility metrics here. I think the important thing is don't have too many metrics.
Okay.
Firstly, you need to have very clear metrics of what you want. Try to connect it to the outcomes that you want to deliver. For example, one of the metrics we have is we have a release every quarterly, certain amount of goals and outcomes that the team has to achieve. Is the sprint contributing and, as you said, being predictable towards achieving those outcomes?
That's an interesting word, predictability.
Yes, predictability towards it. I think the other element I like to look at is to build a continuous improvement mindset and to ensure that is the team continuously looking at improving themselves.
Okay.
And as you said, throughput is a good way to look at it, but not as a means to compare across many teams.
But are they doing it?
But are they showing an increase? Is the rate increasing over time? So those are things I would look for, connected to the outcomes for the quarter or the period which matters to your company. Look at it from a predictability and also look at it from a continuous improvement and a throughput mindset.
Yeah, actually, Ashish, I think you answered the next question.
Okay.
This is from Viva, who wanted to know, how do we maintain predictability while pushing to increase productivity?
Yeah.
I can just
add one point to that is predictability and productivity are both important. And productivity, I approximate into throughput here. What I normally recommend is do predictability first. Get that rhythm
absolutely
in your team so that you have built the sustenance and the continuous rhythm of actual versus planned, and that you can trust the team into getting things done, and then start looking at the throughput.
Absolutely. I think that's the right way to look at it. Become predictable, improve, become predictable at the next level, then improve, become predictable at the next level.
Absolutely.
That's really what.
Yeah, I think the change typically happens in large curves, but also incrementally. The best change is when you can combine them both.
Okay, absolutely. Okay.
JV, I think this question is probably related to what you're talking about, swarming, instead of too many stories getting started. The question is, typically between tech lead and Scrum Master, there are clashes that can happen at times.
Okay.
Scrum Master also reports to tech lead, and when the tech lead is present in meetings, this is, I guess, probably a particular situation that the person is asking about. She leads the meeting, etc. This is like manager becoming Scrum Master in a way. Though TL is not designated as Scrum Master, by virtue of seniority and reporting hierarchy, this kind of behavior sets in.
Okay. It's a very strange situation. One thing that I have always recommended, you don't position the level of the Scrum Master below the level of a tech lead. Now, what essentially ends up happening is that the role gets diluted to a coordination role, right? And many companies do this mistake, that ultimately the Scrum Master's role is to do stand-up meetings, get the plans in shape, make people update, burn down. That's really the focus. Now, you don't need a Scrum Master working in multiple teams to do that job. So if you really are serious about an influential role for the Scrum Master, then don't position the Scrum Master too low, right? From the way I look at that question, it's like Scrum Master, tech lead, manager, and both the tech lead and the Scrum Master of the team, entire set of people report into the manager, which means that the Scrum Master's role on a day-to-day basis is being threatened, right? So I wouldn't recommend that structure at all. I think Scrum Master should be at least positioned from a even not hierarchy or any internal organization level, but at least in terms of importance to the role of a manager. I think that's important to look at.
I think it's important to know that Scrum Master's role really spans, influencing product owners, influencing teams, influencing best practices, influencing many aspects, right? And not the ceremonies and so on and so forth. A tech lead's role is typically, he's the expert of the technology. He's a leader from a technology angle of it. So to have one report into the other might not be the best model. You probably want to have the Scrum Master report to the level where he can do most justice for the span of influence that you want him to have.
Absolutely.
Another interesting question related to tech lead. tech lead is doubling up as a PO for the team. I guess it's probably a technical product, but he's also expected to support the team technically and also do coding of some complex components. He feels overloaded. Well, what can be done? Is this multi-skilling?
I would certainly not, unless it's a highly technical product, in which case make the tech lead the product owner and nothing else. His only job is to make sure that, looks at the product, determines the requirements, writes stories, prioritizes, works with the team to make sure that they understand what needs to be done. I wouldn't confuse the two roles, unless I don't understand the context that this question comes from. So maybe, if you understand the context, we can address that slightly better.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, tech leads are typically some of your best engineers out there.
Yeah.
You want to optimize his use for what his skill best suits.
Absolutely.
Right? So if he's an engineer, don't make him into other roles. But if the product requires a very sharp engineer to define stories as an architect would, and you don't have an architect in your company, for example, then if the tech lead is playing that role, I think that's fine. For the purpose of the architectural need, but I would also urge you to look at getting an architect who can do that role.
Okay. Probably time for one last question. Since both of you touched upon the importance of automation in testing, role of QA, unit testing, and all that, this question is, when we look at test automation, where should we begin? Unit testing or integration testing? How does it work when you are in a legacy application environment?
Okay, let me, because I've personally worked in the testing space for several years in the product side. So maybe I'll attempt it from my understanding of testing. If it's a new product, because this question on legacy, if it's a new product, I believe that as you do the story, you should be developing test cases and test automation as you do it. Don't build a backlog. If it's a new product, write tests as and when you define features. So which means that you start with unit tests, obviously. It's extremely important when you're doing a new product. And then also ensure that integration, the important thing is integration level tests are definitely needed in any case. And if you're building a new product, don't necessarily need to differentiate the two. You still need to do both, unit and integration level. If it's in a legacy situation, there is a little bit of a challenge. I've seen many people come to me and say, how do I write unit tests for a legacy application? They're making a small change there. It becomes an enormous, big proposition. So what I recommend is do whatever you need to do, whatever automation for the areas that you're touching upon. Don't worry about the unit test for the other part of the legacy code. But the important thing in a legacy application is interfaces. Because ultimately, when you make changes, you need to make sure that the whole system integrates and works as an integrator. So I would say for a legacy application, focus a lot on integration tests. Right? Don't worry about unit tests to start with, but do whatever little that you can do, depending on how long is this legacy application going to stay, right? Or how long you're going to use it. So maybe that's a high level.
Well, I'm more biased towards the unit tests. The reason is for the following: if it's a new product, you want to start the practice with an inverted pyramid with more unit tests than others. So you want to always start there.
Absolutely.
And if it's a legacy product, unless it has absolutely no testing, which you probably have lost your customers, you would probably already have integration testing and not enough unit testing. And therefore, I would emphasize the unit testing. So I think it depends on the situation you're in. Yeah. If you've really got a product with absolutely no tests, then yeah, maybe you need to do a stopgap of the integration first. Yeah. But I think a lot of focus has to be done on the unit.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot more questions, but we have absolutely run out of time. So what we will do is all these questions, Ashish and JB, you can respond offline. We will make sure that they go to all the participants. So thank you, Ashish and JB, for taking the time and then sharing your experiences, and particularly the ones that really hurt most of us all the time. I thank all the participants for joining this webinar. I hope you found the discussion insightful and also value-adding. After we close for the day, all of you will receive an email requesting your feedback on this webinar. Please do take a few minutes to share your responses, which will help us plan and execute better on our upcoming webinars. This is a monthly series, so the next one will be sometime in February. Just watch your mailbox for more updates on the topic and the speakers. Thank you once again for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.